We're very pleased to have with us today Charlyne Berens, who's usually with us, but she doesn't always get to present. Today she's presenting on Nebraska's unicameral legislature, still true to its promises. If you've been following it this year, that is a great question. Charlyne retired from in 2014 from UNL College of Journalism and Mass Communications, where she was associate dean and professor. During her years at the university, she taught courses in writing, reporting, and editing, as well as an honors seminar on the First Amendment. She was editor and co-publisher of the Seward County Independent from 1976 to 1990, when she joined UNL. She's also the author of 2 books about the Nebraska Unicameral and 2 political biographies, one of Jerome Warner and one of Chuck Hagel. She holds a PhD in political science from UNL. She is the volunteer co-chair of the curriculum committee for OLLI and develops and facilitates multiple OLLI courses. She's also on the board, a board member of the Nonpartisan Nebraska and of the advisory committee for Civic Nebraska. It gives me great pleasure. Please help me welcome Charlyne Berens.
All right. Okay. It is lovely to see you all here today. I was beginning to think that Mother Nature did not want people to learn about the unicameral because last Thursday I gave a talk on the unicameral. Remember, it snowed. Cut the attendance quite a bit in that group. And so I was expecting the same thing today, but look at all you tough Nebraskans came out no matter what the weather. I appreciate that. And we have people on Zoom. So hello, Zoomers. I'm glad you're here too. Excuse me. That's not a good start, is it? Well, I am honored to be here and to be able to talk to you today about a valuable Nebraska resource, our legislature. We are unique, as I'm sure you know. We're the only one-house nonpartisan legislature in the nation. And we're going to talk today about how the legislature has lived up to what its supporters promised it would do, or not. But before that, we have to put in a little bit of history to lay the groundwork. So why and how is the nonpartisan unicameral what it is? Well, the quick answer might be George Norris. I'm sure most of you are well aware that Norris, who was Nebraska's U.S. Senator at the time, was a driving force behind our legislature. But it didn't happen overnight. Nebraska entered the Union in 1867 with a traditional 2-house partisan body. We didn't make the switch to 1 house until a vote of the people in 1934, and the first session of the unicameral was in 1937. Well, a 1-house nonpartisan legislature didn't just spring full blown from the dust of the Dust Bowl. I don't believe. I think Norris's influence was big, but I think there were some philosophical undercurrents at play. And in fact, I would argue that it was an outgrowth of the populist and progressive philosophies that were major influences in the state from the 1880s on into the 1930s, and actually still are influential here today. So what is populism? Well, briefly, populist theory asserts that an identifiable entity known as the people exists. This is different from James Madison's arguments and promotions at the beginning of the nation that we were going to have interests set against interests. He recognized multiple interests, and that in the process of negotiation and compromise, they would come up with policies that benefited the whole nation. Populists, on the other hand, believe in a unitary people whose will should be carried out. And the people are pretty much everybody who's not one of the few elites. It's a very majoritarian philosophy, and it's still very popular. So let's put this into the context of Nebraska's history. In the 1860s and 70s, at the same time that Nebraska was being settled by white folks, farming was becoming more mechanized and more commercial. That was both a blessing and a curse. Farmers were at the mercy of fluctuating production and an unstable ag economy and farming practices that didn't always adapt to the conditions at hand. You cannot, for example, grow row crops in the sandhills. And the rain does not follow the plow, much as everybody kind of wished it would at the time. So when they were suffering through cycles of boom and bust, many Nebraskans, like people everywhere, looked for villains to blame. And the farmers thought that they were getting ripped off by the bankers and the railroads, and especially the railroads and the grain elevators too. And their discontent found a voice in the Farmers Alliance. It started out as a citizen lobby and soon became a full-fledged political group and was the root of the Populist Party in Nebraska. Nebraska's populism was part of a movement that originated in the 1880s and 90s in the plains and the South. Farmers were struggling against drought, speculators, bank high-handedness, railroad manipulation. And this was the Gilded Age, right? Huge disparities in wealth and privilege. There were the Carnegies and Rockefellers and JP Morgans, and then there was everybody else, pretty much. Sound familiar a little bit? Yeah. But farmers in this era were more educated and better able to communicate among themselves than had been true in previous decades. And they began to rise up against what they saw as the tyranny of the minority, those few elites. And they demanded that government get involved and provide for the good of the people, the people. They got a few representatives elected to state legislatures and a few even to Congress, but it wasn't enough to make much impact. But the political winds had begun to shift. And by the early 1900s, both Republicans and Democrats seemed to be kind of competing to implement this populist goal that government should represent the people. Both parties began to see the need for government regulation of industry and business in the interest of the common folks. Up to this point, you know, the main things government was supposed to do was keep our foreign enemies at bay and keep us from killing each other. Other than that, pretty much leave us alone. Well, the point of view had shifted. And progressivism picked up where populism left off. Progressives still believed in the will of the people, and then they added some specifics. They said, government should work to improve the lot of the people. It should be open to scrutiny by the people. Experts and expertise should be put to work towards that end, and notably, parties and party bosses should take a back seat to the experts. Well, George Norris, longtime representative and then senator from Nebraska, was a progressive, and he'd been agitating for a one-house nonpartisan legislature for his home state since the early 1920s. He wrote this gigantic op-ed for the New York Times, almost a full page. You would never see that anything that length printed anymore, talking about the benefits of a nonpartisan one-house legislature in states like his. So in February of 1934, Norris and other Nebraskans met in Lincoln and kicked off an initiative petition drive to place the constitutional amendment on the ballot that fall. Nebraska was among the first states to pass the initiative petition process to approve that. In 1912, we did it. And that's what made this possible then for them to go ahead and take it upon themselves rather than leaving it up to the legislature. Now, there was a state constitutional convention in 1929 that suggested this as a possibility, but it wasn't one of their final recommendations, and it didn't happen. So Norris and company were promoting the change on the basis of a populist progressive philosophy, and they made some promises that we're going to talk about here today. They said that one house, is this not? Okay, with not very many members would be more straightforward and easier to follow, okay? And notably, they said the parties only got in the way of government by the people. Parties in the legislature, they said, gave power to the few, the party bosses. And besides, Norris said, the business of the state is in no sense partisan. It's a direct quote. Now, this was the part of his argument that got the most blowback from his fellow supporters. They were afraid that the nonpartisan part of the deal would sink the whole thing. That people would say, well, we could maybe buy one house, but nonpartisan? I don't think so. And it did get a lot of criticism. Most of the papers in the state said this is not a good idea. And they said, among other things, that if you take away party structure, that will give the special interests more ways into the process, and that would be even worse. And there was, there's some credibility to that idea. But Norris said that this had to be part of the deal. He said parties got in the way of government by the people. There were some other selling points too. They said that one house would be more responsive and responsible, more efficient and businesslike, that it would be able to react more quickly to the needs of the people, and that lobbying would be forced into the open. They called their proposed institution the model legislature, and they campaigned for it mightily. Norris, who was 73 at the time, we can identify, right? He went all over the state, and the story is that either he wore out a car or he wore out 2 sets of tires. Either way, he just about wore himself out, I think. But he would talk to every group that would listen. He would talk on all these little radio stations, and there were lots in that era. Well, when election day came, the amendment was approved by almost 60% of the voters. That is a solid margin. Now, 2 other amendments on the ballot that fall also passed. One of them repealed prohibition, and the other legalized pari-mutuel betting in the state. And rumor then and ever since has had it that the supporters of the horses and the drinking just told people, vote yes on everything. And that the unicameral kind of got swept along in the tide. But the unicameral amendment passed with the highest margin of approval, about 3-2. It was rejected in only 93 counties, only 9 of 93 counties scattered around the state, and only 73 of 2,029 precincts. So it wasn't like, there was one part of the state that was just absolutely opposed. There were a few people opposed all over, but most of them liked it. 2 other factors probably played a role. For one, it would be cheaper in the midst of the Depression. The 2-house legislature in 1933 had 100 members in the House and 33 in the Senate. Well, we were going to go from that down to something between 30 and 50. So we were going to save some money. And I think it's also possible that Nebraskans, along with the rest of the nation, were kind of swept up in the influence of the New Deal policies. Let's try something different. Let's reform this. Let's make it better. At any rate, Nebraskans had made history. This is probably the most radical innovation in the history of American government. It was a big deal. We changed from 2 houses, partisan structure, 1 house, nonpartisan structure. George Norris gets a lot of the credit for that because Nebraskans were inclined to trust him. And if he said this was a good idea, yeah, well, we could probably go along with that. Well, the amendment itself designates that the legislature will have just 1 house, between 30 and 50 members. And it says the candidates will be elected in a nonpartisan manner. It does not say specifically that the elected senators then, when they get there on the first day of the session, will organize in a nonpartisan manner. But it was assumed that they would. And exactly how to organize was determined by the rules that the new 1-house body would adopt. So the 1935 legislature drew the new districts and settled on 43 members as the most equitable balance, they said, between urban and rural, which I think is pretty interesting. The first unicameral, which met in 1937, set the basic legislative rules. And from the start, the senators and those watching them understood that nonpartisanship was the goal. So, has the unicameral lived up to those promises? Well, let's check a little bit here. Okay, first of all, They said that the new unicameral would be more open to inspection by and input from the people, largely because of its small size and simple structure. Nothing in the structure or the procedures has changed dramatically since then. We still have no conference committees. Conference committees, if you have a two-house legislature, each house comes up with a version of a bill, and they're similar, but they're not identical. So a few people from each body are appointed to be to a conference committee to work out the differences and reconcile the bill. It goes back then to both houses for usually just an up or down vote. No more amendment, no more discussion. Well, that's a small group of people there making a lot of decisions. We have no other house to blame things on. So, you know, if you've got somebody in the lower house and really doesn't think this piece of legislation is a very good idea, but the constituents are saying vote for it, and he or she knows that probably the other house is going to not pass it. Okay, I'll vote the way my constituents want, and then that lousy piece of legislation can be demolished in the other house. Can't do that here. It's one chamber, one house. All the lawmaking is done in one room. The senators themselves and anybody else who wants to look can watch it all being done. Sessions on the floor and in committee are open to the public. And they're broadcast on one of the Nebraska public media channels now. So you don't even have to go to the Capitol to watch the procedures. So yes, I would say our legislature is still pretty open and transparent. In addition, and very importantly, the rules established in 1937 required a public hearing on every single bill, advertised in advance, and they still do. We still follow that rule. So a senator doesn't have to be part of the majority party to get a bill in front of colleagues and the public. And no committee chair can just disappear something she or he doesn't want to deal with. Every bill will be considered, and people will come and testify for and against it. You can go and testify for and against it, and I'm sure many of you have done that. You don't need to be a lobbyist. You don't need to be an authority of some kind. You just show up and sign in and say your piece. Or you can submit your views on the website, and that's another way we stay involved. Also, because of the unicameral's relatively small size, somebody who really wants to get involved in legislation can conceivably contact all 49 senators, right? We went up to 49 in 1965. And you could do that in person. It might take you, a day of wandering around the Capitol, maybe two. You could certainly do it on email. You can do it by phone. 49 people isn't that many. And people tend to know who their legislators are, I think. And we're still nonpartisan, which keeps the body more responsive to the people. I hear this from both senators and observers of the legislature. Now, some critics have said that putting party labels on the ballot would make it easier for voters to make their choice. And I understand the thinking there, because in lots of races, I have to admit, I don't do a lot of research about, the NRD boards and stuff like that. So the party label gives you some hint of how this person's likely to vote. But almost nobody thinks that party discipline in the body itself would be a big improvement, except for the leaders of the state's Democrat and Republican parties. Now, I know what you're thinking. Yeah, right. We know this is supposed to be nonpartisan, but we know what really happens. Senators actually vote along party lines. But here's the deal. Every senator in the legislature is a registered Republican or Democrat. Sometimes we've had an independent, we don't at the moment. So you'll see people fall out along general philosophical lines. You would expect the Republicans to vote more conservatively and the Democrats more liberally in general. But that is not the same thing as a party leader and a party whip telling people how to vote and offering little plums like committee chairmanships and so forth to those who line up and punishments to those who don't. The results tend towards moderation more than they might otherwise. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about nonpartisanship and threats to it a little bit later. Voting coalitions in the unicameral are, though, by definition, nonpartisan, not organized by party apparatus and party discipline. Unlike every other legislature in the country, our unicameral does not meet the first day of the session with the Republicans in one room and the Democrats in the other to elect a majority and minority leader or other party-based leadership positions. So senators don't directly take their marching orders from the party. This absence of party within the legislature, I think, is far more significant than the fact that we don't have party identification on the ballot. This is where nonpartisanship has a chance to become reality. There was a story in the Daily Beast, an online publication focused on politics. This was 8 years ago, but it described the structure of the unicameral as making weird alliances and inter-party strategizing the norm, not the exception. And it portrayed that as a good thing. A political scientist quoted in the story said that the structure fosters a culture of people voting on their conscience rather than by politics. Wow, that's pretty remarkable. And this was, of course, also portrayed as a good thing. So coalitions in the legislature form sometimes on the basis of a rural-urban split or a pro-business and not so pro-business division or a geographic division or just a division of interest and ideology. And the coalitions can shift from one bill to the next. There is generally a core group whose philosophies align enough that they're likely to vote together on certain kinds of bills, but they're not locked into a particular group on every issue by the party and its leadership. Now that means that the senators are all relatively equal. None of them has vastly more power than the others by virtue of party position or seniority, which also doesn't officially count in the unicameral. And all of this contributes to those original goals of equality and efficiency. And the senators have relied on structure, one house, all in one chamber, and the rules, especially that open hearing on every bill, and the absence of party hierarchy, which means that there's no party leader or whip keeping junior members in line. Furthermore, the goals of equality and efficiency have been supported over the years by the unicameral's embrace of that progressive idea that experts and specialists can help make government work better for the people. That was another thing that Norris really pushed. And the gradual addition of staff at all levels has helped to make that possible. Senators now have aides. Committees have a couple of aides. Committees have legal counsel. And there is, for everybody's access, a legislative research office, a fiscal office, an audit office, a bill drafter, all these things that give every senator access to more information to make better decisions. So the unicameral is a far more professional body than the old bicameral had been. And then there's one more factor to consider, the influence of lobbyists in this unique legislative structure. Lobbyists had a really bad name in the 1930s, not that they have a really good name now. Many citizens saw them as representatives of the wealthy elites, sneaking around and trying to help their clients at the expense of the real people. Norris said the proposed unicameral could change that. For one thing, it would be small, and that would make it harder for lobbyists to hide. And it would be nonpartisan. So the lobbyists couldn't just go to the party leaders and persuade them to exercise their clout over the rest of the members. Best of all, in Norris's point of view, the unicameral would have no conference committees where, he said, laws were made in secret and lobbyists only had to work with just a few members of those special committees. Now, I have to point out that much as we may find lobbying distasteful, it is the way most of us exercise our First Amendment right to petition our government. Nearly everybody is represented by some group, right? Teachers, university professors, nurses, farmers, factory workers, beer truck drivers, you name it. There is a group out there representing your interests to the elected officials on your behalf. And we ourselves also lobby when we write letters to our representatives or call them or show up to testify about a bill. And one real advantage of our unicameral system is that it's a lot easier for us, the people, to have access to our representatives and to make our voices heard. So lobbying goes on under a lot more scrutiny and regulation today than it did in the 1930s. One more thing, I'm sure that Norris would be thrilled that the mandated public hearing for every bill is still in place. Because if that were not required, a lobbyist could work with a committee chair to just make some legislation kind of disappear. That's not possible in this body where every single bill must be put up for public debate. So while there have been threats to the rules and to the norms of nonpartisanship, for the most part, nonpartisanship remains the standard. I think that maybe the biggest threat to it is something that wasn't intended to undo nonpartisanship specifically, but that's term limits. Nebraska enacted term limits via initiative petition in 2000. And it was in 2006 that the first senators were barred from running for re-election because they had served their 2 terms. And we're seeing the effects of that more and more as the years go by. For one thing, we've lost a lot of institutional memory and experience. That might not seem like a big deal at first glance, but it can have a big effect. When 1/3 of the senators are brand new, and nobody's been there more than 6 years, it's easier for the parties and the special interests to make their wishes known, and there are no experienced leaders around, really experienced, to counter those voices. And maybe even more importantly, term limits, I think, have had a pervasive effect on who runs for the legislature in the first place. We all know that at all levels of government in the US, it's hard to defeat an incumbent. So generally, somebody who wants to run for office will wait till there's an open seat. Well, a 2-term limit on service in the legislature means we pretty much always know when there will be open seats. And importantly, the parties and special interests know when there will be open seats. And they can spend time recruiting and grooming and supporting candidates that they believe will strongly advance their positions. And if those candidates win, they're likely to feel some link to the party or interest that helped get them elected. I want to make clear, not talking about corruption here, that because you gave to my campaign, I will therefore do your bidding. I don't mean that. But if you've got a group that really supports you, they only chose to support you in the first place because you kind of agreed with them. And now they promoted you, they gave money, they, addressed envelopes. You're going to feel a connection there that you might not otherwise have felt. And I think that has boosted partisanship in the legislature. I also believe that the polarization in the nation is not, for all the other 49 states and not us. We have that same division here, and it plays out in the legislature just as it plays out in every other aspect of life. One more thing I want to say. I keep saying one more thing, but this really is, we're down to the end. The people of Nebraska are generally happy with their unique legislature. And I think that's worth remarking on, considering that at this very hour, perhaps, the legislature is considering approving a constitutional amendment to put on the ballot that would return us to 2 houses and a partisan legislature. In 2017, I got a couple, excuse me, couple of items on the NACIS survey, the Nebraska Annual Social Indicators Survey. One interesting thing I learned was that a lot of Nebraskans, at least the ones who took the survey, almost half seem to be paying relatively little attention to the legislature. Excuse me. But of those who are paying attention, the vast majority seemed to approve. The first item said, the Nebraska legislature should return to a two-house partisan body. 12% agreed, yeah, we should do that. 41% disagreed. And the rest didn't have an opinion, at least they didn't express it. The second item said, Nebraska's legislature seems to work better than two-house legislatures in other states. Only 7% disagreed with that. 41% said, yes, this works better. Compared to the polarized situation we see in Congress these days, our legislature, even with all its problems in this current session, seems to work pretty well. So I think we can make a good argument that our one-house nonpartisan legislature is hanging in there, and that it has indeed let the people farther into the process. It has allowed for more transparency and easier involvement by the people, easier influence from the voters instead of the parties. That's George Norris's legacy and our advantage. And I believe it's something worth guarding. And I thank you for listening. We have time for questions? Okay. We have time for questions. If I'll try to answer if somebody has something to ask.
Do you have any comments on the salary that the legislators are paid?
Yes, when I've done this presentation as 90 minutes, an hour, 20 minutes, and then what we have today. And so some things just didn't get addressed, and that's one, the salaries she asked about. The salary is miserable. $12,000 a year. And it is not just a part-time job, 60 days in one session and 90 in the other. It goes on and on and on. When the amendment was passed, George Norris actually put a dollar figure in there because he was concerned about this, that legislators weren't being paid enough. So he put in, I think it was, I don't have it in front of me, 37,500, and this was 1930s, remember? And that was to be divided among however many they actually decided between the 30 and 50. And that would be a boost from where they had been. Well, the trouble is you put that in the Constitution and there's only way to raise the salary is to pass another constitutional amendment. And that's hard to do. Nebraskans are not noted for wanting to spend money on anything, and certainly not on I said to my grandfather one time who lived in Fall City, we ought to pay those people more. He said, well, if they did something, maybe we'd pay them more. Pretty common attitude, I think. But the trouble with that is that it really limits who can run, you know? You either have to be retired, independently wealthy, sometimes just starting out in life and willing to sacrifice for a few years, you know, and do your thing, or have a job that, like being an attorney, maybe that you could, you know, schedule yourself around things. It really is a detriment, I think, to even better government. It's a miracle that it turns out as well as it does in a lot of ways, because I think the people who run, for the most part, whether we agree with them or not, they aren't there to make money. They believe they have something to offer. They believe they have ideas that would be valuable to the state. And so, you know, I give them credit for doing that.
Thank you. Can you briefly explain how this filibuster is going to play out?
I don't know the details on the filibuster because I have not kept close track of the rules. But the idea with a filibuster is that what she's doing right now, what Michaela Kavanaugh's doing, is trying to use up all the debate time so that they won't get to some of the bills that she doesn't like. And the filibuster is really annoying when you're in the majority because it protects the rights of the minority. And it's a rule. It's not a law. If they wanted to change it, they could. If they wanted to get rid of it. But at the moment, we're listening to Michaela Kavanaugh talk about Girl Scout cookies and anything else she wants. She was not well, yes, she was in the legislature when Ernie Chambers came back for his second round. And so she learned well from him. Yeah.
I'd like to ask you, what is the influence of the governor of the state on bipartisan politics. How would you assess that?
The governor, this is an interesting question. The governor, what's the influence of the governor? I just lost the name of the man who was governor at the time that we passed this new system. I'll think of it in a minute. At any rate, he said when they were campaigning for it, this should be fine. It'll be fine. Well, after the first session with a Unicameral, he said they didn't even consider my budget, and he did not like it. When I did the biography of Jerome Warner, who had been the chair of the Appropriations Committee forever, he said, yeah, in this legislature, the governor proposes and the legislature disposes. The legislature has more power at that point, he felt, than had been true in the past. Now, that's probably changed too, as we've gotten more partisan, and I don't mean, they're not representing their party officially in the legislature, but people who strongly believe in partisan goals. The governor has found some people he can really line up. Now but still, there's no party leader there to say, we're going to do this because the governor proposed it. So, but it's stronger than it had been, I think. Yeah.
Do you think there's support for moving to 12-year term limit as opposed to 8?
Oh, I hope so. I would like to see term limits gone entirely, except some days when I'm really annoyed with somebody and think, oh my gosh, thank God he's going to be gone pretty soon. But I don't think that the state is likely to just ditch the whole thing, but maybe we can move to 3 terms and have at least a little more experience there. And, what's interesting is that we passed this term limit thing, but hardly anybody had been staying very long. I've got those numbers here someplace, but it's just a relatively small number of people who stayed past 2 terms and very few that stayed past 3. And they were people like Jerome Warner and others who were wise and thoughtful statesmen. So it's too bad. And I know that there's a theory that says, although nobody's been able to prove it, that it was to get rid of Ernie Chambers that we passed term limits. And it's possible. But then he came back. So
am I on? Oh, there we go. This is about term limits also.
I can't hear him.
There you go.
How about that? Okay,
Yeah.
this is about term limits too. And I think that the jury's out yet on term limits. And I would argue that in a sense, term limits are a continuation of the populist policies and philosophies of the state.
Yeah, I'll buy that. We can see what happens. Yeah, it hasn't been that long, that we can really say, well, we saw a definite decline here or a definite change here. So yeah, it could be the jury is still out. And it does sound like a populist thing. Yes. Listen to the people. You're not going to be standing up there, you guys who run over and over again and telling us what to do. So yeah, that's a good point. Nothing from the Zoomers?
Yeah.
No. Okay.
Okay, I have another one. It seems to me that, how do I put it? The whole system lacks a little regulation that it had with senior senators. When I first started with the state, there was a limit to the number of bills people could introduce that was self-imposed, because they can do that under the laws. And I think that should be returned. And then also, there was a hierarchy. In other words, junior senators rarely spoke on the floor. They spoke in committees, but they didn't speak. And people like Jerome Warner and some of the others, were very strong. Now, that was a good thing for discipline. Whether it was good for populism, I don't know. But I would like to see them limit the number of bills, because I think the place has gone wild. It's insane. And because of I'm afraid that eventually that's going to kill the hearings on every bill. If you meet,
Oh,
with
yeah, I
other-
see what you mean.
if you meet with other legislators from other states, they're fascinated with the way we do things.
Mhm.
They can be a senator or a congressman and never get involved in anything because they aren't in the hierarchy. They're
Mhm.
fairly new.
Mhm.
They're told what to do. And the conference committee, of course, is the death of democracy.
Yeah, I agree. And where did we start with it? I think there is a limit on the number of bills each senator can introduce. I'm pretty sure, unless I'm really missed something. There's definitely a limit on the number they can only designate one each as priority, and the speaker the committees can designate 5, I believe, and the speaker then can do 25, but it's not just his bills. It's, he looks at whatever other people have designated and sorts them out and picks 25. So there's some limit, but yes, I mean, I've talked to senators, a lot of senators who say they go to conferences of state legislators, and the other people are going, really? You sponsored a bill in your first year? How can this be? We didn't get to even speak for a couple of years. I am fortunate to be able to talk to the new senators after every 2 years after the election to give them some of this history and background. And I said to them this year, you can be really glad you got elected to this legislature because you will have more voice and more independence and more influence here than almost anybody does in a more traditional body. There's a lot of that equality yet. So there are disadvantages to it. It's a little more chaotic, but it, I think, is a reflection of the voice of the people should be heard, and we'll do that in the legislature.
Charlyne, do you think that the importance of the support systems like legislative aids, committee aids, bill drafter's office, all the supports that you mentioned earlier have elevated in terms of their importance with term limits? Does that provide some continuity from year to year?
Sure. Yeah, it does. And what the other position I think has gotten a lot more important is the clerk. Because the clerk is the one who knows the rules. It has been there. Pat O'Donnell had been there for 40 some years. So he really knows how the place runs. And the man who took over now, Brandon, oh goodness, I'm sorry. Metzger, thank you. And he's been on the staff there a long time. And so he understands that. That's important. But those offices that help draft bills and talk about their budget implications and all that stuff. It's important for each senator. It gives them more clout, really, because they can propose something that's reasonable and it's going to fly. And it makes it more efficient too, because you aren't going to have some bill that's written by somebody who's been there for 6 weeks or even a year and can't be done for whatever reason. And so I think it's a real advantage. In the 50s yet, I think it was in the 50s, the senators still had a desk on the floor of the chamber, and that was all. They didn't have an office, they didn't have an aide, they had nothing. Now they each have a legislative aide and then a clerical aide. And that's still not a huge staff, but it's more than a lot of places. And it just seems in this era to be essential to keep the place functioning. So we're helped out a lot by that.
Charlyne, I wondered if you would let us know what you think are good sources for staying up to date on state and local political news, given the evolution of the news media.
Yeah. She asked what would be good sources to keep up on political news, given that the media are struggling. The newspapers that used to blanket the legislative coverage, are not able to do that anymore. But there's the Nebraska Examiner online, free. If you don't have a subscription, get one. They do fabulous stuff. There's the Flatwater Free Press. It does less day-to-day coverage of the legislature, but hits the big issues. One of which lately was nitrates in water across the state. And then, the Journal Star and the World Herald are practically one paper now. They're owned by the same group. And you see the stories from one in the other, but it's there. They're covering the legislature. Not every single thing as much as before, but it is there. I can't even tell you, Nebraska Public Media does regular coverage too. If you listen in the evening, Fred Knapp is on telling us what happened today in some of the biggest hearings and the biggest stories. Those would be my best recommendations. It's hard for TV, for example, to cover the legislature because they don't have much time. They can't get into a lot of depth. And most of these things are too complicated for a 3-minute story. You really need a little more time and depth to it. So.
Charlyne.
Yes.
Yep.
Larry.
Larry Ruth, a distant relative, right? My question is, your role, you're not a lobbyist, but you have an influence in the legislature. And has that come about because we have a strong university with, what's the role there?
Oh my, I don't know that I have any particular influence. I can't shut up, I'll tell you that. I realized in recent years that when I started doing my dissertation, I was a very non-traditional grad student. So this is the 90s. I'm doing this stuff about the legislature. And then I wrote another book after I got done with that. And I never in the world thought that nobody else would do anything more. It's like, wait a minute, why isn't somebody else doing this research? And so, but I guess people tend to be interested in the history. How did this come about? And what's it supposed to do? What's different, and what's it supposed to accomplish for us? And if I can help people understand that, then I'm glad to do it. And yes, we have a strong university. Respected university.
Charlyne, we have 3 questions from Zoomers.
Okay.
The first is, should a governor be allowed to influence the legislature by heavily funding elections around the state?
Let's go talk to the Supreme Court. The US Supreme Court has pretty much thrown out every attempt at regulating government political spending. And they did it decisively in Citizens United in 2014. Somebody tell me the date. I'm terrible with dates, I'm sorry. But at any rate, there are almost no limits on what can be spent. So do I think it's deplorable? Yes, I sure do. It bothers me dreadfully, but there is really not any recourse until, John Bender, we would modify the Constitution to make it legal to do this. And you watch the Congress, see if they're going to do that. In the meantime, I think fresh air and daylight is the best thing we can do. Let's keep an eye on who's spending. And that should help us make some decisions about how to where to put our own support. Yeah.
Second question is, where does the concept of continually redrawing district boundaries fit into preserving or hindering the nonpartisan nature of the unicameral?
Oh, redistricting is a political process and has been from day one. And it's political here. And in fact, you would get no argument from pretty much anybody that it's probably the most political thing that the nonpartisan unicameral does, the most partisan thing. At the moment, because we do have more Republicans than Democrats, registered Democrats in the body, the Republican group, the conservatives, had a lot to say about how we were going to redraw districts after the last census. And it's a political decision, and we can we can fuss about it, but, and we can, again, bring daylight to it. There's a group of mathematicians who are very concerned about gerrymandering. We had an OLLI class with them a few years ago about how you can draw districts to be, you can make them legal, you can make the population pretty equal, but you can draw them for a specific purpose to make them heavily one party or the other. And the court has said they're not going to get involved with that, the Supreme Court. They said you can't legally gerrymander on the basis of race, but political parties aren't even in the Constitution. We don't have anything to say about that. So they refuse to get involved.
The last question is kind of a 2 or 3 part question. It talks about public hearings and the beauty of public hearings. Are there any studies that describe the citizens' use of public hearings? Are those testifying and writing testimony diverse and inclusive of the common people? And do we use this option? I think we do use this option.
Yeah, I think we do use the option. And I don't know of any studies about how many people, testify on a specific issue or how many do on each side of an issue. That'd be an interesting thing to do. We need to find some graduate students who are looking for a topic. But it's an option that's open to all of us, and we can choose to use it or not. But Nebraskans tend to. I mean, earlier in the session, remember the stories about people down the hall and they couldn't even, they were there till 10 o'clock at night and they still didn't get everybody in. The written testimony, if you submit it through the website, will become part of the record. It's not just something that's read and then goes away. It becomes part of the permanent record, which is a way to make your voice known. Will you always get what you want? Oh my goodness, no. But there's a real satisfaction to making your voice known. And in fact, I would like to say that next to voting, contacting your representatives in government is probably the most important thing you can do for democracy. So go for it.
Anything else?
This was so much fun. Thank you all. Thank you.